It began with a smudge of red clay on a pristine white carpet. On the morning of October 12th, 1978, in the quiet, segregated town of Oak Haven, Alabama, the rising sun cast long, accusatory shadows through the bay window of Carolyn Beaumont's bedroom. The air inside the grand mansion on Magnolia Ridge was still and heavy, smelling faintly of lavender and old money. But there, just beneath the recently broken window latch, was the small, greasy smear, an earthy, unwelcome intrusion. It was the color of a wound, a secret carried in from the outside world. This single, insignificant detail, noticed only by the young woman who knelt to clean it, was the silent beginning of a story that would take more than 4 decades to tell. It was a truth that would lie dormant, buried under the weight of power, grief, and the town's determined silence, waiting for time to unearth it. Alara Mae Thompson's life was a study in shadows and silence. At 24, she moved through Oak Haven like a phantom, her existence dictated by the needs of others. Her day began long before the first rooster crowed, in the small clapboard house she shared with her mother, Pearl, in the part of town they called the Hollow. Here, on the east side of the train tracks, the roads were unpaved, and the air hung thick with the smell of wood smoke and damp soil. Alara's world was one of worn linoleum floors, the quiet hiss of a percolator on the stove, and the shared, unspoken anxieties about bills that never seemed to shrink. Her dreams, whatever they had once been, were now as faint and distant as the whistle of the 5 a.m. freight train that rattled their window panes. A mournful sound that signaled the start of another long day of invisible labor. Her first job was at the Oak Haven First National Bank, where she arrived before dawn to erase the traces of the previous day. She mopped the cavernous marble lobby, her movements practiced and efficient, polishing the brass fixtures until they gleamed under the fluorescent lights. She breathed in the sterile scent of ammonia and floor wax, knowing that in a few hours, powerful men like Harrison Beaumont would walk through these doors, their footsteps echoing with an authority she could never imagine. They would touch the handles she had polished and stand on the floors she had scrubbed, never once considering the hands that had made it all immaculate. Alara was a ghost in the machine of their world. Essential but entirely unseen, her contribution measured only by the absence of dirt, a silent testament to her own invisibility. By the afternoon, her path led her across the tracks to Magnolia Ridge, the exclusive enclave where the town's founding families lived, in sprawling, white-columned mansions. She entered the Beaumont residence through the back door, a silent transition into another realm. Here, the air was different, cool and still, scented with lemon oil and the faint, sweet perfume of potpourri. She cleaned rooms filled with priceless antiques and heavy velvet curtains that blocked out the harsh Alabama sun. She emptied wastebaskets containing discarded letters and wiped dust from silver-framed photographs of a smiling, perfect family. She overheard fragments of hushed arguments and the careless laughter of Caroline, the golden daughter of the house. In this place, Alara learned the art of making herself smaller, of moving so quietly that she barely disturbed the air around her. The contrast between her two lives was a chasm she crossed every day. In the Hollow, life was raw, communal, and lived mostly outdoors on sagging front porches. Sounds were loud. Gospel music from a nearby church, children's laughter, the arguments of neighbors. On Magnolia Ridge, life was contained within thick, insulated walls, a world of manicured lawns and unspoken rules. Alara existed as the connective tissue between these two realities, carrying the dust of one world into the other on the soles of her worn-out shoes. She knew the intimate details of both, the way her mother hummed hymns while mending clothes, and the specific way Mr. Beaumont liked his whiskey decanter placed on the mahogany sideboard. This dual existence gave her a unique perspective, a quiet understanding of the town's fragile, carefully constructed social order. Pearl Thompson was the anchor of Alara's world, a woman whose entire history could be read in the geography of her hands. Her knuckles were swollen from a lifetime of scrubbing floors and wringing out laundry, her palms calloused, but her touch always gentle. She moved about their small kitchen with a slow, deliberate grace, her faith a silent, constant companion. She hummed gospel hymns while she cooked, low and soft, melodies that spoke of endurance rather than joy. Pearl saw the world through a lens of cautious realism, her advice to Alara a constant refrain. Keep your head down, child. Don't draw no notice. It was a philosophy of survival, born from years of navigating a world that was not built for them. Her love for her daughter was fierce and protective, a quiet fortress against the town's indifference. The walk to the bank in the pre-dawn chill was a ritual of transition. Alara's footsteps were soft on the packed dirt sidewalks of the hollow, where the air still carried the scent of last night's wood fires. She'd nod at the few other figures moving in the half-light, men heading to the lumber mill, women to the kitchens of Magnolia Ridge. The world was quiet, save for the distant crow of a rooster or the growl of a lone truck. Then she would reach the train tracks, the town's great divider. Crossing them was like stepping into another country. The dirt roads abruptly became smooth asphalt. The modest clapboard houses gave way to neat brick homes with manicured lawns, and the very air seemed to thin, losing its earthy communal scent for something more sterile and solitary. Inside the bank, the silence was vast and intimidating. Her own breathing seemed to echo off the polished marble. The work was physically demanding, a battle against the endless accumulation of dust and grime. Her back ached from pushing the heavy buffer, and her hands, even through gloves, were perpetually chapped from the harsh cleaning chemicals. It was a lonely, thankless task. She was erasing the evidence of other people's lives, the smudged fingerprints on the glass doors, the dirt tracked in on expensive leather shoes, all before the sun was fully up. She worked with a focused intensity, her movements economical and precise. Her presence was a paradox. She was there to make the space perfect, yet the success of her job depended on no one ever realizing she had been there at all. There was a life inside Alara that no one in Oakhaven ever saw. Tucked away in a drawer beneath her neatly folded clothes was a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, a book she had read a dozen times. Years ago, she had dreamed of becoming a teacher, of standing before a classroom of children from the Hollow and opening up the world to them through words. But her father's early death and her mother's failing health had quietly closed that door, leaving only the practical necessity of earning a wage. The dream hadn't died so much as it had been put away, like a treasured but impractical heirloom. Sometimes, while polishing the brass nameplate of Harrison Beaumont, she would imagine a different name there, a different life, before shaking the thought away as a foolish indulgence. The midday break was a brief return to sanity. The hurried walk home, the sun now high and hot, was a journey back to herself. Pearl would have a plate waiting for her, a piece of cornbread and a bowl of collard greens, or perhaps some leftover black-eyed peas. They would eat at the small kitchen table, the screen door letting in a slivering breeze and the sound of a neighbor's radio. Their conversations were never about the grand houses or the powerful people Alara served. They were about the price of flour, the health of an elderly woman down the street, the letter from a cousin in Chicago. For one precious hour, Alara was not a cleaner or a housekeeper. She was just Pearl's daughter, sitting in her own home, eating her mother's food. It was an anchor in the long day. Then came the second crossing, the afternoon journey back over the tracks to Magnolia Ridge. If the morning walk was a quiet transition, this one felt like a formal crossing of a border. The sun beat down on the wide, pristine streets, reflecting off the gleaming paint of parked cars. Here, the silence was different. Not the peaceful quiet of early morning, but a manicured, watchful stillness. The rustle of oak leaves and the distant whir of a lawn sprinkler were the only sounds. Each house was a fortress set back on a sea of perfect green grass. Entering the Beaumont property through the wrought iron gate at the back, next to the garbage cans, was a daily reminder of her place. She was permitted into this world, but only through the service entrance, a clear and unspoken rule. The air inside the Beaumont mansion was always cool, a stark contrast to the humid Alabama heat. It smelled of beeswax, lemon polish, and a faint, cloying scent of roses from the porcelain vases in the foyer. The house was a museum of a life she could barely comprehend, filled with objects that seemed to exist only to be looked at. Heavy silver candelabras, leather-bound books that looked as if they had never been opened, a grand piano whose keys were never touched. Her job was to maintain this illusion of effortless perfection. She moved from room to room like a spirit, armed with a feather duster and a soft cloth. Her presence meant to be felt only in the resulting cleanliness. the absence of any speck of dust that might betray the reality of daily life. Her most intimate and unsettling task was cleaning Caroline's bedroom. The room was a whirlwind of teenage life, a stark contrast to the sterile order of the rest of the house. It smelled of expensive perfume and hairspray. Clothes were often strewn on a silk chaise lounge, and romance novels were tucked under the pillow. Alara would carefully gather the clothes, fold them, and wipe the dust from the collection of delicate glass animals on the dresser. She saw the discarded drafts of homework, the ticket stubs from a movie theater, the private, messy evidence of a life of privilege and ease. She felt a strange mix of resentment and empathy for this girl, whose biggest worries seemed to be what to wear to a party or which boy to like. From her invisible vantage point, Alara became an unwilling expert on the Beaumont family's silent dysfunctions. She learned to read the tension in the house as easily as she could read the weather. She knew that a slammed door upstairs meant Mr. Beaumont was displeased, and that the long, quiet afternoons when Mrs. Beaumont stayed in her room with a headache were best navigated with extreme caution. She overheard snippets of arguments, hushed and sharp, that would cease the moment she entered a room. They were a family performing a play of Southern gentility, and she was the unseen stagehand who cleaned up after the performance, acutely aware that the smiling portraits on the wall told a much simpler, more pleasant story than the truth. Leaving the Beaumont house at the end of the day felt like a physical release of pressure. Walking back toward the tracks, she would take a deep breath, the warm, humid air of the evening feeling clean and real after the refrigerated stillness of the mansion. The setting sun cast a golden light over the hollow, and the sounds of life returned. The laughter of children playing stickball in the street, the sizzle of frying chicken from an open window, the friendly call of a neighbor from a front porch. Here she could walk with her head up. She was no longer a shadow drifting through someone else's space. As she crossed back into her own neighborhood, she felt the tight knot in her shoulders begin to loosen, the armor of her invisibility slowly dissolving. Evenings were spent with her mother on their small, screened-in front porch. It was their sanctuary. As dusk settled, the world outside softened, the fireflies beginning their nightly dance in the tall grass. They would sit in matching wooden rocking chairs, the rhythmic creak a comforting metronome to their quiet companionship. Sometimes they would shell peas into a large metal bowl that rested between them, their hands moving in a familiar, synchronized rhythm. Other times, Pearl would read from her Bible while Alara mended a tire in her work uniform. They rarely needed to speak much. Their shared presence was enough, a silent affirmation of their bond, a small pocket of peace carved out of a world that offered them very little. But even on the porch, the worries of their life were never far away. The specter of money was a constant, unwelcome guest. Alara's two meager salaries were stretched to their absolute limit, a delicate balancing act of paying for rent, utilities, and Pearl's heart medication. Every dollar was accounted for in a small, dog-eared notebook Alara kept. An unexpected expense, like a worn-out pair of shoes or a sudden rise in the price of rice, could throw their fragile budget into chaos. Alara carried this burden silently, shielding her mother from the worst of it, but the anxiety settled in her own stomach, a low, persistent hum of fear about what the next month might bring, and how much longer she could keep them afloat. In the hollow, however, Alara was not just a pair of working hands. She was a person. When she walked to the corner store for a loaf of bread, Mr. Henderson, the owner, would greet her by name and ask after her mother. The older women sitting on their porches would offer a warm, "Evening, Alara May," as she passed. In this small, tightly knit community, bound together by shared circumstance and a common history, she had a place. They were all struggling, all living under the same oppressive social structure, and this created a quiet, unspoken solidarity. Here, her humanity was reflected back at her in the faces of her neighbors. It was a stark contrast to the world of Magnolia Ridge, where her existence was acknowledged only by the tasks she completed. On some nights, after Pearl had gone to bed, Alara would stand at her small bedroom window, which faced west. Through the branches of a large pecan tree, she could see the distant, scattered lights of Magnolia Ridge. They twinkled like cold, inaccessible stars, a different galaxy entirely. It was a world that employed her, but would never accept her. A world whose secrets she knew, but whose comforts she could never share. She would stand there for a long time, watching the lights, a silent observer caught between two Americas. The train whistle would sound in the distance, a mournful cry in the night, and Alara would feel the profound, unshakable loneliness of her position, a bridge between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. The morning of October 12th, 1978, began for Alara Mae Thompson as every other morning did, in darkness. The alarm clock was the 4:30 a.m. freight train, its mournful whistle a signal to rise before the sun. She moved through the small house in silence, washing her face with cold water from the basin, the shock of it a familiar and necessary jolt. Her clothes were already laid out, a faded, functional gray dress and worn-out support shoes. In the kitchen, Pearl was already awake, a small, stooped figure humming a low gospel tune over the stove. Breakfast was a bowl of grits with a pat of margarine, eaten at the small wooden table. "Air's got a bite to it," Pearl said, her voice raspy with sleep. "Don't you go catching a chill." Alara simply nodded, the warm, bland food a comfort against the day ahead. Her walk to the bank was a solitary pilgrimage through a sleeping town. Oakhaven was decorated for the annual Fall Festival, and the unlit strings of colored bulbs hanging over Main Street looked like strange sleeping serpents in the pre-dawn gloom. The air smelled of damp fallen leaves and the distant sweet scent of cotton candy from the concession stands being set up on the square. She crossed the railroad tracks, the metallic click of her heels on the steel rails, marking the transition from her world to theirs. On the other side, the sidewalks were swept clean, and the houses were dark and silent, behind their perfectly manicured lawns. She felt the familiar shift inside herself, pulling the cloak of invisibility tighter around her shoulders as she approached the imposing marble columns of the Oakhaven First National Bank. The work inside the bank was a familiar, lonely rhythm of ammonia and wax. She pushed the heavy buffer across the marble floors, its drone the only sound in the cavernous space. The building held the chill of the night, and she could see her breath as she polished the brass nameplate on Harrison Beaumont's office door. Today, the routine felt different, charged with the town's festive energy. Someone had left a flyer for the festival parade on a teller's counter, its cheerful orange and black colors a stark contrast to the bank's somber greens and grays. She worked methodically, erasing every trace of the previous day, ensuring the stage was perfectly set for the powerful men who would soon arrive, never knowing the ghost who had prepared it for them. Her success was measured in her own erasure. Her midday return home was a brief, precious intermission. The sun was higher now, casting a weak, autumnal light over the hollow. Pearl had a plate of leftover black-eyed peas and a piece of cornbread waiting for her. They ate in their usual comfortable silence, the sounds of the neighborhood drifting in through the screen door. "They say the parade's going to have a real marching band this year," Pearl remarked, breaking a piece of cornbread into her bowl. "You be careful over on the ridge this afternoon. Festival time makes people act foolish." Alara assured her she would, knowing her mother's warning was less about foolishness and more about the unpredictable tempers of the wealthy, a danger that was always present but sharpened by public events and the consumption of alcohol. The atmosphere at the Beaumont mansion that afternoon was one of controlled, festive chaos. The air, usually still and scented with lemon oil, was now thick with the aroma of baked ham and roses. Mrs. Beaumont was directing the placement of floral arrangements in the foyer, her voice tight with stress. Alara slipped in through the back, a phantom moving through the preparations for a party she would never attend. She went about her tasks, dusting furniture and emptying wastebaskets, feeling more peripheral than ever. The house buzzed with an energy that excluded her completely, a low hum of privilege and anticipation. Her job was to clean the spaces around their excitement, to make sure the backdrop for their memories was flawless, unblemished by the reality of labor. Her final task of the day was Caroline's bedroom. The 17-year-old was a whirlwind of silk and perfume, holding up dresses to her reflection in the full-length mirror, her mind already at the festival. "Does this yellow make me look washed out?" she asked, not to Alara specifically, but to the room itself. Alara, busy gathering discarded clothes from a chair, offered a quiet, "It's a lovely color on you, Miss Caroline." The girl barely registered the response, already discarding the dress for another. She was vibrantly, carelessly alive, a creature of light and motion. Alara moved around her, a quiet, methodical shadow, her presence as unremarkable to Caroline as the furniture in the room. a simple part of the scenery of her life. As she worked her way to the large bay window, Alara noticed it. The latch, usually stiff and difficult to operate, was bent at an unnatural angle, the metal twisted as if forced. She had cleaned this window just yesterday and knew for a fact it had been secure. Her eyes followed a line down from the broken latch to the pristine white carpet below. There, pressed deep into the fibers, was a distinct greasy smudge of red clay. It wasn't just dirt. It was the specific, iron-rich soil from the old quarry on the edge of town, a place of overgrown weeds and teenage dares. It was a detail so wrong, so profoundly out of place in this immaculate room, that it sent a small, cold shiver down her spine. Caroline, now satisfied with a pale blue dress, grabbed a small beaded purse from her bed. She gave a final glance in the mirror, a bright, confident smile on her face. "Don't wait up!" she called out, a cheerful command directed at no one in particular as she hurried from the room. Alara heard her light, quick footsteps descending the grand staircase, the muffled sound of the heavy front door opening and closing, and then the rumble of a car engine starting in the driveway. A moment later, there was only silence. Alara stood frozen for a second, the scent of Caroline's perfume hanging in the air. Her gaze was fixed on the small, ugly smear of red clay, an earthy wound on the perfect white carpet. The walk home was a disorienting journey through a town transformed. The sun was setting, and the festival lights had been switched on, casting a magical, multicolored glow over the crowded streets. The air was filled with the sounds of a brass band, the shouts of children, and the general roar of a community celebrating itself. Alara kept to the shadows, an outsider moving through a celebration that felt a world away. The image of the broken latch and the red smudge played over and over in her mind, a discordant note in the evening's cheerful symphony. When she finally crossed the tracks, the festive noise receded behind her, and the familiar quiet calm of the hollow settled around her like a heavy blanket. The unease, however, followed her all the way to her front door. That night, the sky opened up. A ferocious thunderstorm swept through Oakhaven, its violent winds tearing at the festival banners and its torrential rain washing the confetti from the streets. Alara and Pearl sat in their rocking chairs on the screened-in porch, watching the lightning illuminate the landscape in stark, momentary flashes. The power grids, old and unreliable, flickered once, twice, then surrendered, plunging the entire town into an absolute, profound darkness. Across town in the silent, rain-lashed mansion on Magnolia Ridge, the phone began to ring. It rang and rang, a shrill, unanswered cry in the empty house. The storm passed, leaving behind a dripping, unnerving quiet. The thin line had been severed. A life had vanished into the noise of the festival and the violence of the storm. The dawn that broke over Oakhaven on October 13th was unnaturally clean, the world scrubbed raw by the night's violent storm. On Magnolia Ridge, the silence inside the Beaumont mansion was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket. It was Caroline's mother, Elizabeth, who found the room empty. The pale blue dress from the previous evening was gone, but the bed was perfectly made, the pillows uncrushed, the covers turned down in a pristine, mocking invitation. It was a room waiting for an occupant who had never arrived. Her first sound was not a scream, but a small, sharp intake of breath, the quiet beginning of a panic that would soon consume the house. Then the town. The first frantic phone calls were made, her voice a thin, cracking thread against the vast, echoing stillness of the morning, each unanswered ring deepening the certainty that something was terribly wrong. The official response arrived with a quiet, deferential gravity. 2 county sheriff's vehicles crunched softly up the long, gravel driveway, their movements slow and respectful, as if approaching a sacred site. Sheriff Brody, a stout man whose political career was underwritten by Harrison Beaumont's bank, emerged from the first car. He removed his hat as he walked to the door, his demeanor that of an employee rather than an officer of the law. He spoke to the Beaumonts in hushed tones, his questions framed as gentle suggestions. Behind him, young Deputy Frank Miller stood with his notepad, his eyes taking in the opulent foyer, the grand staircase, and the palpable tension in the air. He was a functionary in a drama whose script had already been written by the powerful man now pacing in the study. Harrison Beaumont did not collapse into grief. He went to war. From the mahogany-paneled fortress of his study, he became a field commander, his voice a low, controlled weapon on the telephone. He wasn't a father searching for a child. He was an institution protecting its most valuable asset. He called the governor's office, bypassing local channels. He called the state's most powerful newspaper editor, carefully curating the details, planting the seed of an outside threat. A drifter, a transient, a faceless evil that had breached their perfect town. Every conversation was a strategic move designed to shape the narrative, to build a fortress of public opinion around his family. He was directing the search, but more importantly, he was directing the story, ensuring it flowed in a channel of his own making, away from the house and its secrets. The news seeped into Magnolia Ridge like a contagion, a series of hushed, frantic phone calls between the sprawling mansions. Over coffee in their sunrooms, the wives of Oakhaven's elite dissected the unthinkable. Had anyone seen anything? A neighbor, Mrs. Gable, whose property adjoined the Beaumonts, recalled seeing the headlights of Caroline's convertible sweeping out of the driveway the night before. But the festival traffic had been a constant stream, and she couldn't be sure of the time. Was it 7 o'clock? 8? Her memory was a watercolor painting left out in the rain, its details bleeding into a useless, blurry impression. Still, her vague recollection was seized upon by the sheriff as the first piece of the official timeline, a flimsy brick laid in the foundation of the unfolding investigation. In the hollow, the news traveled on foot, carried by workers returning from their early shifts. It was discussed in guarded tones on front porches and over the counter at the corner store. The fear here was different, less about the fate of the missing girl and more about the inevitable backlash. Pearl Thompson's face was a mask of grim resignation as she listened to the story from a neighbor. She turned to Alara, her voice low and firm. "You hear me, child? That family's trouble is a storm we don't stand in. You did your work, and you came home. That's all you know." Alara nodded, the image of the broken latch and the red clay smudge burning in her mind. It was a small, dangerous piece of a puzzle she knew she was forbidden to solve. By noon, the Oakhaven Chronicle's special edition was on the streets, the ink still smelling fresh. The headline, stark and black, screamed, "Beaumont Heiress Vanishes." The article, penned by a reporter who had spoken only to Harrison Beaumont and Sheriff Brody, was a masterpiece of curated fiction. It described Caroline as a local saint, a girl without a shadow, viciously snatched from the sanctity of her bedroom. It devoted 2 paragraphs to the unsubstantiated sighting of a suspicious vagrant near the bus depot hours before the disappearance. The narrative was set: a perfect family violated by an external evil. Alara Mae Thompson, the last person to see Caroline, was not mentioned. In the official story of that day, she had already ceased to exist. Deputy Frank Miller arrived at the Thompson house in the late afternoon. He stood awkwardly in their small, clean kitchen, his large frame seeming to fill the entire space. He was polite, his questions direct but not unkind. Alara sat at the table, her hands clasped in her lap, and told him what she had seen. She described the bent window latch and the greasy smear of red clay on the white rug, her voice even and quiet. He wrote it all down in his small, spiral-bound notebook, pausing to look up at her. "The old quarry?" he asked, a flicker of something. Interest, confusion in his eyes. "You're certain?" She just nodded. He thanked her for her time and left, but Alara felt the weight of his visit long after his car had pulled away. She had handed him a piece of the truth, and she feared it would simply be buried. The town square was transformed into a command center for the volunteer search. A large map was tacked to a board outside the courthouse, and men in hunting gear huddled around it, pointing at sections of woodland. Trestle tables were set up, laden with coffee urns and donated sandwiches. And then there were the posters. Caroline's prom photo, a professional portrait of a smiling, confident girl with bright eyes, was suddenly everywhere. Her face was taped to the windows of the pharmacy, the diner, the hardware store. It was stapled to telephone poles, the staples biting into the wood with a sharp, percussive finality. The town was papered with her image, a constant, smiling reminder of the void she had left behind. Her face became a symbol of a community's stolen innocence. Inside the official investigation, certain threads were quietly snipped. Caroline's best friend, Sarah Beth, told Sheriff Brody that Caroline had been acting strangely for weeks. She spoke of a secret boyfriend, someone her father would never approve of, a boy from the less reputable side of town. The sheriff listened patiently, nodding, but his report dismissed it as typical teenage romanticism and unrelated to the clear evidence of a forced abduction. The investigation was being steered with a firm, invisible hand, its path meticulously cleared of any inconvenient truths that might lead back toward Magnolia Ridge. The narrative of the violent outsider was too clean, too useful, to be complicated by the messy realities of a 17-year-old girl's life. The search parties were a great performance of civic concern. For days, hundreds of men fanned out across the fields and forests bordering Oakhaven, their fluorescent orange vests bright against the muted autumn landscape. They beat the bushes with sticks and called Caroline's name until their voices were hoarse. It was a loud, public, and ultimately fruitless display. The one place they did not go was the old abandoned quarry. The official reason was that it was in the opposite direction of the drifters' supposed path. The red clay smudge, a single sentence in Deputy Miller's report, was deemed an anomaly, an irrelevant detail in a house full of them. The search was a spectacle of looking, but only in the places where they were sure they would find nothing. As days bled into a week, the initial frantic energy began to curdle into a grim, exhausted resignation. The national news vans, having harvested their quota of tragic sound bites from the grieving family, packed up their cameras and moved on. The posters of Caroline started to peel at the corners, the rain causing the ink of her smile to run like mascara. The organized search parties dwindled, replaced by the low, persistent hum of gossip and speculation. The sharp edge of the crisis was gone, and what remained was a dull, chronic ache. The town was learning to live with the void, to walk around it, to incorporate it into the local landscape like an old, unmarked grave. Hope was not lost in a single moment, but eroded slowly, grain by grain. In the absence of facts, the town's imagination ran wild. On the local radio station's morning talk show, callers offered their own theories, each one more lurid than the last. She had been taken by a traveling carnival worker. She had run off to join a religious cult in California. She was sold by her abductor and was now living in a foreign country. The story became a public commodity, twisted and reshaped to fit the fears and prejudices of whoever was telling it. The real Caroline, the girl who loved romance novels and worried about the color of her dress, was completely lost, buried under an avalanche of public fantasy. She was no longer a person. She was a local legend, a cautionary tale in the making. Alara moved through the changed town like a sleepwalker, the weight of her unspoken knowledge a physical burden. The atmosphere in both of her workplaces was thick with the disappearance. At the bank, she polished the brass nameplate on Harrison Beaumont's door, while inside he conducted his business with a cold, terrifying composure. At the mansion, she cleaned rooms that felt like tombs, the silence broken only by the muffled sobs of Mrs. Beaumont from behind her closed bedroom door. Alara dusted the silver-framed photos of the smiling, perfect family, her movements slow and deliberate. She was a ghost in a house of ghosts, tasked with maintaining the serene, orderly surface of a world that had fractured from within. 2 weeks after the disappearance, a new witness came forward. A long-haul truck driver passing through Oakhaven on his way to Montgomery told a state trooper he had seen something on the night of the festival. He remembered a convertible, like Caroline's, parked on the overgrown shoulder of the old quarry road. Behind it, another car was parked, a large, dark sedan with its lights off. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, just kids looking for privacy. But now, he wasn't so sure. The trooper took down his statement, thanked him, and filed the report. It was sent to the Oakhaven Sheriff's Department, where it was placed in a growing stack of paperwork, another inconvenient detail that failed to align with the accepted truth. The search for Caroline Beaumont was never officially called off. It simply faded away. The posters remained for months, their colors bleaching in the winter sun, her smiling face slowly dissolving back into the paper it was printed on. The void she left behind settled over the town, becoming a permanent part of its geography. People learned not to mention her name in front of the Beaumonts. Teenagers started telling ghost stories about the girl who vanished from the fall festival. The raw, open wound of her absence was beginning to scar over, forming the hard, protective tissue of myth. For Alara, however, there was no myth. There was only the memory of red clay on a white carpet, a truth that lay dormant and silent, waiting. Time did not heal the wound in the Beaumont house. It only deepened it, turning the vast mansion into a mausoleum of memory. The first year was a study in absences. Caroline's 18th birthday passed in a suffocating silence, marked only by her mother, Elizabeth, placing a single, unopened gift on the girl's perfectly made bed. Christmas came, and the long, polished dining table had a conspicuous void, a place setting that was never cleared, a ghost at the feast. Harrison Beaumont's grief was a different beast. It was a hardening, a calcification of his already stern demeanor. He walled himself off in his study, his silence more terrifying than any rage. The house on Magnolia Ridge became a place where the clocks ticked, but time stood still, forever frozen on an autumn evening in 1978. 5 years slid by, and Oakhaven began to forget. The Fall Festival, after a 2-year hiatus, returned, its cheerful music a discordant note against the town's lingering shadow. New businesses opened on Main Street, their bright signs covering the faded outlines where Caroline's posters had once been taped. But for the Beaumonts, the world outside might as well have ceased to exist. Elizabeth became a recluse, a pale figure seen only through the upstairs windows, her life reduced to the careful preservation of her daughter's bedroom. Harrison, in turn, poured his energy into the bank, wielding his influence like a weapon, as if accumulating more power could somehow fill the chasm that had opened in his life. The silence between them grew into a solid, impassable wall, each trapped on their own side of a shared, unspeakable sorrow. For Alara Mae Thompson, the passage of time was marked by different losses. A decade after Caroline's disappearance, her mother, Pearl, passed away quietly in her sleep, leaving Alara the sole occupant of the small, clapboard house in the hollow. Now in her mid-30s, she still moved through the town like a ghost, her knowledge of the red clay smudge a cold, hard stone she carried in the pit of her stomach. She watched Oakhaven change, seeing the old corner store where Mr. Henderson knew her name get torn down to make way for a soulless convenience store. She would sometimes see Frank Miller, now Sheriff Miller, across the town square, his face etched with a permanent weariness, and she knew he carried a piece of that night with him too, a small, splintered fragment of the truth she held whole. 15 years. Caroline would have been 32, perhaps with children of her own. The world had spun on, but inside the Beaumont mansion, it was always 1978. Alara, who had finally left her job with the family a few years prior, still heard stories from the woman who replaced her. Caroline's room remained a shrine untouched and immaculate. Her clothes hung in the closet, the pale blue dress she wore that night, presumably absent, the rest waiting for a body that would never return. The collection of delicate glass animals on her dresser was dusted weekly, their fragile forms a metaphor for the life that had been so easily shattered. The room was not a memorial. It was a denial, a stubborn refusal to let the girl be truly gone, a perfectly preserved testament to a grief that had curdled into madness. 2 decades after she vanished, Carolyn Beaumont had fully transitioned from a missing person to a local legend. Her story became a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered by teenagers who dared each other to sneak onto the grounds of the old quarry. Harrison Beaumont, now in his early 70s, was a figure of myth himself, a reclusive patriarch rarely seen outside the high walls of his estate. His iron grip on the town had not loosened, but it was now the grip of a phantom, exercised through phone calls and proxies. The Oakhaven First National Bank had a new, modern glass facade, but the institution, like the man who ran it, was a relic, its foundations resting on secrets and a carefully maintained silence that had held for 20 years. The slow, corrosive power of time was most evident in the physical decay of the Beaumonts themselves. 30 years after the disappearance, Elizabeth Beaumont finally succumbed, her death certificate citing heart failure. But the whole town knew the truth. She had died of a broken heart, her spirit having fled her body long ago. Her passing left Harrison utterly alone in the cavernous, echoing house. He was now a king ruling over an empire of ghosts. His wife, his daughter, the perfect family that existed only in the silver frames on the mantelpiece. The mansion itself seemed to breathe a sigh of weary resignation, the white paint on its grand columns beginning to peel, the once manicured gardens slowly surrendering their orderly lines to the persistent encroachment of wild ivy and weeds. In the hollow, time brought a different kind of change. 40 years on, Alara, now in her 60s, had watched her neighborhood transform. The dirt roads were finally paved, and many of the old clapboard houses were replaced by modest but new brick homes. Families who had no memory of the 1978 Fall Festival moved in, their children's laughter filling the air, diluting the old sorrows. The train tracks still marked a division, but it was a softer one, more about history than present reality. Yet for Alara, the invisible architecture of the past remained. She would sit on her porch, the same porch she had shared with her mother, and feel the unyielding presence of that long-ago night, a truth that had aged with her, becoming a quiet, inseparable part of her own soul. The official narrative, so carefully constructed by Harrison Beaumont, began to fray at the edges with the slow passage of years. Frank Miller, upon his retirement, after a long and unremarkable tenure as sheriff, gave a single, reluctant interview to a local college student for a history project. When asked about the Beaumont case, a shadow crossed his face. He spoke of it as the great regret of his career, mentioning unpursued avenues and the weight of influence on a small-town investigation. His words were vague, couched in the careful language of a man who knew better than to speak plainly, but they were the first public crack in the monolithic story the town had accepted for decades. The interview was filed away in the college library, a small, forgotten tremor before the earthquake. By 2022, 44 years had passed. The world was a place of smartphones and ceaseless information, a reality that would have been science fiction in 1978. Oakhaven was a quiet, sleepy town, bypassed by a new interstate, its former vitality now a thing of nostalgia. The Beaumont mansion stood on Magnolia Ridge like a great, graying headstone, a monument to a forgotten dynasty and its famous tragedy. Harrison Beaumont, now 96, was a specter, a name that belonged more to history than to the living. For most residents, the story of his daughter was a piece of local trivia. But time, for all its power to erode and bury, had not destroyed the truth. It had merely been patient, allowing it to lie dormant beneath the surface, waiting. For Alara Mae Thompson, life had settled into a quiet, predictable rhythm. She tended the small vegetable garden behind her house, attended Sunday services at the church where her mother had once sung in the choir, and watched the seasons change from her front porch. The memory of Caroline, of the broken latch and the red clay, was no longer a sharp, daily pain but a dull, chronic ache, a part of her own history. She had carried the silence for a lifetime, a solitary witness to a truth the world had chosen to ignore. The past was a locked room, and she had long ago accepted that it would remain so. But time is not just an agent of decay, it is also an agent of unearthing. And its work in Oakhaven was not yet finished. The past did not announce its return with a thunderclap, but with the mundane groan of rusted metal. In the summer of 2022, a small construction crew was hired to demolish a dilapidated garden shed at the far edge of the Beaumont property, which had been sold to developers after Harrison's death a month prior. The structure had been slowly surrendering to gravity for years, its wood rotten and its roof caved in. As a young worker pried up the last of the warped floorboards, his crowbar struck something hard. He knelt, brushing away decades of dirt and debris, and uncovered a corroded metal lockbox, heavy and sealed by rust. Knowing the property's infamous history, the crew foreman didn't hesitate. He placed the box carefully in the cab of his truck and drove it directly to the Oakhaven Sheriff's Department, an unsolicited artifact from a town's forgotten tragedy. At the station, the lockbox was treated with a cautious reverence, like a piece of unexploded ordnance from a long-finished war. A technician worked for over an hour, carefully grinding away the rusted lock mechanism until the lid finally gave way with a tired sigh of metal. Inside, nestled in the dry, dark space, lay a small, leather-bound diary. It was remarkably preserved, its pages yellowed but intact, protected from the damp Alabama air for nearly half a century. The officers in the room fell silent, staring at the object. It felt intimate, forbidden. This wasn't just evidence. It was a voice, a whisper from a ghost that had haunted their town for as long as anyone could remember. The diary was carefully photographed, bagged, and sent to the state forensic lab, its quiet presence promising to upend a history everyone thought was settled. Weeks later, the report came back. Using advanced imaging technology, technicians had been able to read the faded, spidery ink on every page. The voice that emerged was not the saint from the town's mythology, but a real, complicated 17-year-old girl. Caroline Beaumont wrote of the suffocating weight of her family's name, the pressure to be perfect, and a secret, forbidden romance with a boy from a rival family her father despised. The pages were filled with a desperate yearning for a life of her own, far from the cold, controlling grip of Magnolia Ridge. She was not a passive victim waiting to be snatched. She was a young woman on the verge of rebellion, her diary the only place she could confess her growing fear and her plans to escape the gilded cage her father had built for her. The final entry, dated the evening of October 12, 1978, was written in a frantic, almost illegible scrawl. The words tumbled onto the page, a torrent of fear and desperate hope. "He found out about us," she wrote. "He took the letters. He said he would rather see me gone than see the Beaumont name disgraced by that family. He said I broke his heart." The entry ended with a chilling, fateful plan, a daughter's naive belief in her father's love. "He wants to meet. He says we can talk it through, fix this. I'm meeting him at the old quarry in an hour. He promised he'd listen." The pronoun was stark and terrifyingly clear. The monster wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. He had been inside the house all along. The meeting wasn't for reconciliation, it was an execution. The diary landed on the desk of Detective Isabel Rios, a sharp, methodical investigator who had grown up in Oakhaven hearing ghost stories about the missing Beaumont girl. The official narrative had never sat right with her. She pulled the original case files from the archives, the paper brittle and smelling of dust and time. She read through the witness statements, the dead-end leads, the reports that steered the investigation so cleanly away from the family. And then she found it. Deputy Frank Miller's original interview notes. Tucked away in the neat, concise report was a single, dismissed observation from the housekeeper, Elara Mae Thompson. Rios read the words, and a cold certainty settled over her. Broken latch on bay window. Greasy smudge of red clay, consistent with quarry soil, on white carpet below. The next morning, Detective Rios drove her unmarked car across the railroad tracks, into a part of town the department rarely visited unless there was trouble. She found Elara Mae Thompson, now 68, a woman with a quiet, dignified air, tending to a small plot of tomatoes in her backyard. Rios didn't approach with the aggressive posture of law enforcement. She came as a listener. She sat with Elara at the small kitchen table, the same table where a young Deputy Miller had sat 44 years before. She placed a copy of Miller's old report on the table between them and simply asked, "Ma'am, could you please tell me again what you saw that day? Tell me everything you remember." The request was an invitation, an opening of a door that had been locked for a lifetime. Elara looked at the young detective's face, seeing for the first time not suspicion or dismissal, but genuine inquiry. She took a deep breath, and the memories, perfectly preserved, came flooding back. She spoke in a low, steady voice, her words painting a picture with a clarity that time had not dimmed. She described the unnatural angle of the broken window latch, the specific greasy texture of the red clay smudge against the pure white of the carpet fibers, the lingering scent of Caroline's expensive perfume in the silent room. Her testimony was not that of a confused bystander. It was the precise, unshakable account of a witness whose observations had been deliberately buried. She had carried this truth like a stone for 44 years, and now, finally, someone was willing to help her set it down. As Rios listened, the last crucial piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The diary had provided the motive and the meeting place. Elara's testimony provided the physical evidence that connected the crime scene back to the killer. The red clay from the quarry, where Caroline had gone to meet her father, had been on his shoes when he returned to the house. He had climbed back through her window to stage the scene of an abduction, to create the fiction of a violent outsider, and in his haste, he had left a single damning trace of his presence. It was a small mistake, an insignificant detail that had been reported by an insignificant person and was therefore ignored. The truth had been there all along, waiting in a dusty file, visible only to eyes willing to see. The revelation settled in the small, quiet kitchen, not as a shocking explosion, but as a profound, soul-crushing weight. The entire mythology of Oakhaven, the story of the perfect family shattered by an external evil, was a lie, a carefully constructed narrative to hide a monstrous truth. Harrison Beaumont, the town's great patriarch, its benevolent ruler, had not lost his daughter. He had sacrificed her to his own pride. The crime was not a mystery to be solved, but a secret that had been brutally kept. The silence that had shrouded the town for decades was not born of grief, but of complicity, a collective turning away from a truth that was too close, too ugly, and too powerful to confront. When Detective Rios finally left, she shook Alara's hand, her grip firm and her eyes filled with a sad, respectful understanding. For Alara, there was no feeling of triumph, no cathartic release of righteous anger. The vindication was a ghost, arriving decades too late to matter. She sat on her porch, the same porch where she had sat with her mother, and watched the afternoon light filter through the leaves of the old pecan tree. The truth was finally out, but it felt less like a victory and more like an elegy. It was a quiet confirmation of what she had always known, that some truths are only heard when the people who silenced them are gone, and that justice, when it arrives this late, feels almost indistinguishable from sorrow. The news of Harrison Beaumont's confession, a quiet admission given from a hospital bed before his death, did not tear through Oakhaven like a storm. It seeped into the town's foundations like a slow, toxic flood. There were no public outcries, no calls for vengeance. Instead, a profound and unsettling quiet descended. The town's central myth, the story of its martyred princess and the evil that came from outside, had been a lie. People looked at the imposing facade of the Oakhaven First National Bank differently, seeing not a symbol of civic strength, but a monument to a monstrous deception. Neighbors who had known the Beaumonts their whole lives had to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the man who had sacrificed his own daughter to pride. The truth, once revealed, did not cleanse the town. It simply exposed the rot that had been there all along, leaving behind a shared, unspoken shame. Following the directions in Carolyn's diary, a state forensic team excavated a small, forgotten section of the old quarry. They worked for 2 days under the quiet watch of the Alabama pines, their methodical movements a stark contrast to the frantic, performative searches of 44 years prior. In the damp red clay, they found what was left of her: a few brittle bones, a small silver locket tarnished almost black, and the metal buckle from a shoe. The discovery was announced with a sterile, official press release, but for those who remembered, the news was a physical blow. The ghost that had haunted their town for a lifetime finally had a grave. The vague, mythic tragedy was now anchored to the earth, reduced to a small, heartbreaking collection of artifacts that told a story of a young life brutally and permanently extinguished. A funeral was held a week later. It was a small, awkward affair, attended by a handful of distant Beaumont relatives and a few townspeople old enough to remember. The casket was sleek and modern, a strange vessel for a girl who had died in 1978. Alara Mae Thompson attended, sitting alone in a back pew, an invisible witness to the end of a story she had carried for a lifetime. She watched the proceedings with a profound, aching sorrow, not just for the girl whose life had been stolen, but for the truth that had been buried for so long. There was no sense of victory or vindication, only the heavy, oppressive weight of time and loss. Justice had arrived, but it was a ghost, a hollow echo in a mostly empty church, decades too late to bring comfort to anyone. A few days after the service, Alara drove her old car out to the quarry road. She didn't get out, simply parking where the pavement gave way to overgrown weeds and red dirt. She sat for a long time, the engine off, listening to the sound of the wind in the trees. This was the place, This was the source of the red clay smudge that had lived in her memory for nearly half a century. It was an ugly, unremarkable patch of land, yet it held the beginning and the end of everything. She felt no anger, no release. She felt only a deep, bone-weary sadness. She had carried a single, crucial piece of this place with her for her entire adult life, and now, finally, she could leave it here where it belonged. She put the car in gear and drove away without looking back. That evening, Alara sat in her rocking chair on the front porch, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and the coming night. The sounds of her neighborhood were a familiar comfort, a quiet rhythm that had sustained her through the years. The world now knew the truth she had held in silence, but her life remained unchanged. The burden was gone, but the space it occupied was now filled with a vast, echoing quiet. She looked at the empty rocking chair beside her, the one where her mother had sat, and remembered Pearl's long-ago warning, "Don't draw no notice." It was the advice that had kept her safe but had cost her a lifetime of silence. As the fireflies began their slow, silent dance in the twilight, Alara Mae Thompson closed her eyes, a solitary figure on a porch, finally at peace with a truth that had brought no peace at all.